Okay, now that we've learned about the squash and stretch, we can try this quickly with the same bouncing ball exercise that we had before and improve it. I'll show you how to use the rig and how to add some squash and stretch on the first bounces of the ball, and later you can finish the rest on your own. Let's open up the file assignment_section05. Here we have the same rig of a rubber ball that we used in our previous assignment. So you already know that the blue square control at the bottom, which is called the global control, is used for the ball's placement in the scene. And we usually set the first key on it, but then leave it alone and no longer animate it. Then we have a smaller red square control called global offset, which we use for the ball's movement, and a yellow round rotation control, which we use to rotate the ball. Now, let's move on to our new controls. We have two smaller purple round controls which are responsible for the squash and stretch, and you can use them only by selecting them and changing their value in the channel box. I will remind you that the quick way to change the value of any channel is to click on the channel name in the channel box, then move your cursor to the viewport, and while holding the middle mouse button, drag it left or right. So, if you select the upper purple control, you will stretch or squash the ball from the top. And lower will do the same, but from the bottom. Though I don't recommend using them both at the same time, because that will probably give unwanted results. For example, this. So only use one of the squash and stretch controls at a time. Finally, the big pink square in the middle of our ball is called squash rotation, and we can use it to set a direction for our squash and stretch. If we rotate the squash direction, then when we use the squash and stretch control, it will stretch the ball not from the middle of it, but from the side. Now I will quickly block out the first part of a bouncing ball across the screen. As usual, select all the controls and save the first pose. Make sure that you have the auto key turned on. Let's select the global offset control and move the ball to the side as we did before, and then up. That is the first pose of our ball, and now let's do a couple of bounces just like we did before. First, let's go to frame 90 and move the ball to the other side of the screen. Then let's open the graph editor and take a look at the translation Z channel. Here we need to fix the curve so that it has a constant speed at the beginning and a slowdown at the end. Now we can quickly block out the lowest and highest poses of the ball. Let's save a key on frame 12, then 22, 32, 40, 48, and you can finish the rest on your own. I've shrunk my timeline so that I can focus on the part that I'm currently animating, which is the first part of the bouncing ball. Let's go to the graph editor again, translation Y, and fix the lowest parts of the curve. So that our ball would accelerate because of the gravity before hitting the ground, and then jump back with almost the same amount of energy. Okay, we have our bounces. Now let's move on to the squash and stretch part. We know that when the ball hits the ground, it squashes down, so we can start with that. Let's go to frame 12 when our ball comes first in contact with the ground, and select our squash upper control and squash our ball down. Though perhaps not all the way down so it wouldn't look too rubbery. It would be a good idea now to select all the controls before we move any further and save our main poses, go over the keys that we already have, and set a keyframe for all the controls, so we know for sure that on those frames our poses are set and can no longer be affected by anything that happens on any other frames before them. Alright, we have the squash on the first contact pose. Then, when it's up in the air, we know that the ball gets back to its original shape, so we can zero out the squash. Then, when we reach our second contact with the ground and squash again, and we zero it out when it's up in the air. Okay, we have our main poses and can move on. We know that when the ball is falling down and speeding up, right before it reaches the ground, it stretches up. So, on a frame before the squash, we should select Squash Rotation Control and rotate the squash control into the direction the ball is coming from. So we rotate it to the left. Now we can select the Squash Upper Control and stretch up the ball. So when the ball is coming down, it stretches up, then contacts the ground and squashes down. And when it jumps back, it stretches again, only this time in the opposite direction towards where it is jumping to. So we need to rotate the controls to the right. Then we need to stretch the lower part of the ball when it's coming off the ground. But remember, we can't use the upper and lower controls at the same time, so don't forget to zero out the upper control. Now we can select the Squash Lower Control, and the other way. Stretch the ball down. OK. Repeat the same process. Select the Squash Rotation Control, rotate it to the left. Select the upper control and stretch the ball up. I know that my lower control doesn't have any value, but for some reason my ball was stretched in a weird way, and that can happen when the viewport does not update. So just go to another frame, and then go back to the frame you were working on to update the viewport, and now our ball has the right shape. Okay, then we go down and up again, so we need to rotate the controls to the right side, zero out the upper control, and stretch the lower one. Finally, the last stretch. Let's look at the graph editor at our upper squash channel values. I know that when the ball is going down and reaches its most stretched position, I don't want to have a slow in to that pose. I want it to be sudden because the ball is speeding up. So I want to change all the upper keys, break the tangents, and lower the curve down. I also don't want to slow in here, so we can do a linear spline on this one. Then don't forget the lower squash control. Here I want to do the same thing. When it comes from the squash into the stretch, I don't want to have a slow in, so break those tangents and bring the handle down. Though the change happens in just one frame, it's so fast that we probably won't even notice that, but I still want you to have a habit of going over the curves and cleaning them up. Let's look at the animation. I think we can improve one thing. I've noticed that when we stretch the ball, even though it happens just one frame before the contact with the ground, our ball is still quite high up, and we want to stretch right before we reach the ground. So I want to lower the ball here. We can do that by going back to the translation Y channel and lowering the curve which we brought up before, because it turns out that we created a curve shape whose values are changing too drastically. So we need to select the handles and lower them down. We will still be speeding up, but not so dramatically. That way our ball on a frame before the contact will be much lower than before. Thus, we won't have such a huge contrast between the poses, which even our eyes couldn't understand. Now let's check the animation again. I think that looks more natural. This is how you add some squash and stretch to the bouncing ball exercise, and you should decide on the amount of squash and stretch that you want to use and finish the rest of the exercise on your own. If you'd like to give some squash and stretch to your animation of a rubber ball bounce from the previous section, you can do that by going to that scene and opening the rubber ball group in the outliner. Here, expand rubber ball global curve, then global offset. And here you'll find squash rotation control, which was there all along, just hidden. So select it and unhide it by hitting the H. Now you'll be able to add some squash and stretch to your already existing animation of this rig. We've learned about the squash and stretch principle and used it on the bouncing ball animation. In the next lesson, I will introduce you to another one of the principles called anticipation. See you there!